My name is Claire Anderson. I am 32 years old, and this past Christmas I returned to my family's mansion for the first time in years. From the outside, it looked perfect. $20 million of glass and stone glittering under the winter lights, but stepping inside reminded me why I had stayed away. The rooms were still filled with the same voices that had once dismissed me, the same laughter that always seemed to come at my expense. I thought maybe time had softened them, that age had brought perspective, but I was wrong. Within minutes of walking through that front door, I was reminded of the place they had always tried to keep me in. I stood there listening, watching, waiting, carrying a truth they never imagined I held. That night, the balance inside that house shifted in a way no one could take back. What happened after shook more than just walls and chandeliers. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when years of being overlooked turn into the moment you finally take control? Stay with me, because once you hear what unfolded on Christmas Eve, you will not forget it. Let me take you back to where it began. I arrived 15 minutes early to my sister's wedding, not because I was excited, but because respect had always mattered to me. The hotel ballroom in downtown Boston glowed with chandeliers and rows of white orchids. Everything was polished, perfect, a reflection of Samantha's vision of herself. My heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound swallowed quickly by the rising hum of laughter and champagne glasses. Faces turned toward each other, never toward me. That was no surprise. I had lived with that silence for years. I walked along the rows of tables, each set with gold-trimmed china and folded napkins shaped like swans. Calligraphy cards marked every guest's place. Samantha and her husband Richard at the head table, my parents at table 2, the bridal party, nearby neighbors and colleagues scattered through the rest. I kept scanning, waiting to see my name. Claire Anderson. It was nowhere. I read the chart twice, my finger trailing the ink, as if somehow I had missed it. A woman in a headset clipboard pressed against her chest noticed my hesitation. She approached with a professional smile that looked more rehearsed than real. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I don't see my name on the list." Her eyes darted down, then she tapped the paper. "Yes, Miss Anderson, you are at table 14. Table 14, I repeated. She gestured toward the back of the room. By the kitchen doors, there were some last-minute changes. The words slid off her tongue too easily. I nodded once, thanking her, though my stomach tightened. I turned toward the back. Past the polished tables, past the white orchids, past relatives who glanced my way, and then quickly back at their glasses of wine. I reached the far corner. Table 14 was pushed close to the swinging kitchen doors. The tablecloth was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. 2 servers sat there on break, whispering and laughing until they saw me. One of them jumped up, face flushed, and hurried away. The smell of garlic and roasted lamb drifted out each time the doors swung open. The clatter of pans and hurried voices from the kitchen spilled into the space where I was expected to sit. I lowered myself onto the chair. It wobbled slightly under my weight. For a moment I stared at the empty place, setting a water glass without ice, a napkin folded crooked. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I heard her voice, smooth, clear, and loud enough for the nearby tables to catch every syllable. "She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff." Richard chuckled beside her, his arms snug around hers. A ripple of quiet laughter spread from their circle. I turned my head slowly. Samantha stood glowing in lace and diamonds, her smile sharp. My mother stood a few feet away, adjusting the ribbon on a floral arch, her hands trembling slightly, but her face composed. My father had his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring toward the dance floor, as if nothing had happened. Our eyes met for a single moment. Jason's wife, Richard, smug, glanced my sister's perfect posture. Then Jason himself, my own brother, the man I had come to support, looked at me. His mouth opened just slightly, then closed again. He looked away. That was worse than any insult. Their silence was the verdict. The sting rose behind my eyes, but I refused to let it show. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of tears. My lips curled into a smile, cold and certain. I reached into my clutch and wrapped my hand around the smooth weight of my phone. My fingers didn't shake. My breath stayed even. I held it there for a moment, feeling its power, then let it rest again against the fabric. Not yet. A waiter passed close by carrying a tray of champagne. He hesitated, caught my eye, then quickly looked away. Even he seemed to understand what this table meant. I smoothed the hem of my dress back straight, chin lifted. Let them watch me from their golden tables. Let them believe they had cornered me into humiliation. The music swelled from the string quartet near the stage. Guests leaned into each other, laughing at Richard's jokes, praising Samantha's elegance. None of them noticed the woman sitting by the kitchen doors. That had always been my place, on the edge of things visible but unseen. I listened to the clatter of dishes behind me, the muffled shouts of chefs, the laughter of people who had decided my worth. I folded my hands together, resting them calmly in my lap. The sting in my chest cooled into something sharper, steadier. Every laugh, every averted eye, every deliberate dismissal carved deeper into my memory. I wanted to remember the heat of this moment, the sound of the doors swinging, the hollow ache of exclusion. Because when the time came, I would need that fire. I sat there, surrounded by the fragrance of garlic and the echo of laughter, the bride radiant, at the center of the ballroom, the groom smirking at her side. My parents silent, my brother complicit. I felt the weight of it pressing down, but I did not break. I let the silence settle over me, heavy and humiliating, and I let it harden into resolve. The violins carried on the servers hurried past, the champagne sparkled in the lights, and I sat at table 14 with my back straight and my eyes steady, knowing this night was not about their celebration anymore. It was about me and what I would decide to do next. When I was a child in our little town outside of Worcester, I learned early what it meant to stand in someone else's shadow. Samantha was 3 years older than me, and from the very beginning she shined in every room she entered. At least, that was what everyone said. She would sing off-key at school assemblies, and people clapped as if she were on Broadway. I brought home a ribbon for winning the regional spelling bee, and it sat on the counter for 2 days before disappearing into a drawer. I remember one summer when I was 9. I had worked for weeks on a science fair project, a careful model of a solar system with each planet painted and suspended just right. My teacher praised the detail, even asked if she could keep it as an example for future classes. I rushed home with my certificate, proud and hoping maybe this time my parents would notice. Instead, the living room was filled with chatter about Samantha's role in a community play. She had 2 lines, both mumbled, but my mother beamed as though she had carried the whole production. My certificate ended up tucked behind the refrigerator magnet, slowly curling at the edges. Birthdays told the story even clearer. For Samantha's 16th, my parents rented out a banquet hall, ordered a custom cake, and invited half the neighborhood. She twirled in a new dress, cameras flashing, the golden daughter stepping into adulthood. When I turned 16, we had dinner at the kitchen table. My father lit 2 candles on a store-bought pie, and my mother handed me an envelope with $50 inside. It was not cruelty. It was the quiet, constant message that I should not expect more. At school, I tried to find a place where I could not be compared. I joined the debate team, stayed late in the library, worked after-class jobs to buy my own clothes. I earned A's across every subject, not because anyone pushed me, but because I pushed myself. My teachers called me disciplined, reliable, even brilliant. But at home, the words never echoed. I learned to stop waiting. One night stands out in sharp relief. Samantha had snuck out to a party and missed curfew. My father paced the living room furious, my mother wringing her hands. When Samantha finally stumbled in, smelling of smoke and cheap beer, she burst into tears. My father's anger melted into relief. My mother hugged her and said she was just young, that mistakes happen. Then my father turned on me. "Why didn't you stop her, Claire? You should have been watching." I had been upstairs studying for an exam. I went to bed that night with a bitter taste of responsibility for things I had not done. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped raising my hand at dinner. I listened instead, memorizing the rhythm of how our family worked. Samantha talked about cheerleading, my parents nodded along. I mentioned being invited to a statewide math competition, and the subject shifted to whether we should repaint the living room. Slowly, I understood. My words did not carry weight at that table. It was not just about attention. It shaped how I saw myself. I did not rebel, I did not demand. I learned to thrive quietly. I discovered that when you stop expecting recognition, you can focus on results. I worked shifts at the diner down the street, stacking tips into an envelope under my mattress. I filled notebooks with ideas about businesses I wanted to start someday, models of things I could build. Samantha dated boys with shiny cars, came home late, and was excused. I walked home in the cold after closing, counting the dollars I had earned, and promising myself that someday I would not need their approval. There was one rare exception. My grandmother, who lived 2 towns over, saw me. She came to my middle school graduation and pressed a hand to my cheek. "You are the steady one, Claire," she whispered. "Do not let them forget that." I held on to those words more tightly than any trophy. She passed away when I was 15, and after that the house felt emptier than ever. Years later, when Samantha went off to college in New York, my parents visited her every other weekend. They brought groceries, paid for extra tutoring when she struggled, and called her every night. When I began applying to schools, I asked my father if he could look over my essays. He waved his hand and said I would figure it out, that I always did. I stayed up late, editing my own drafts, researching scholarships, and filling out forms alone. Somehow, I managed. It was during those years I stopped waiting for fairness. I built a shell around myself. At school, I was seen. At home, I was invisible. That contrast sharpened me. It made me determined, though I did not realize it then. Each slight, each silence, each forgotten achievement became a stone stacked in a wall I would one day stand on. I think back sometimes to the night Samantha came home late again, this time, after scraping our neighbor's mailbox with my father's car. My mother cried, my father raged, but in the end they turned to me. "Why didn't you tell us she was going out?" I was already away at college by then, 3 hours from home. Still, they found a way to fold me into her mistake. I remember hanging up the phone that night and staring at the ceiling of my dorm room, wondering how far I would have to go before I stopped being the one blamed for her recklessness. Looking back, I see now that those years shaped the woman I became. I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the forgotten one. But I was also the one who learned to endure, to watch closely, to plan in silence. My family thought that made me weak. They never understood that patience and invisibility are not the same thing. All those memories pressed against me as I sat by the kitchen doors at Samantha's wedding. The laughter, the music, the smell of garlic and roasted lamb, it all layered over years of being sidelined. Nothing about this humiliation was new. It was simply the latest chapter in a book they thought would never end. I folded my hands in my lap, letting the past and the present blur into one. The child ignored the teenager, overlooked the young woman, underestimated. All of it had brought me here. And I felt something shift, quiet but undeniable, a reminder that one day their silence would not be the last word. When my father founded Anderson Holdings back in 1990, he built it from a single office suite above a diner in Providence. He bought neglected commercial properties, patched them up, leased them to small businesses, and turned steady cash flow into something bigger year by year. By the time I was old enough to understand, the company had grown into a respected name in regional real estate. To me, it was more than bricks and leases. It was the proof of his discipline, the pride he carried every morning when he put on his tie and left before dawn. Samantha was pulled into the fold early. Even as a teenager, she sat in on meetings, her name printed on glossy business cards, long before she knew what half the terms meant. By the time she graduated college, my father had given her an office with her name on the door. In 2018, when he announced her as the new CEO, the applause in the room felt rehearsed, like everyone had seen the script except me. I smiled and clapped too, but something inside me sank. I had taken a different path, After college, I earned my MBA at NYU Stern from 2015 to 2017, burying myself in finance modeling and the art of building strategy from numbers. I came back eager, full of ideas, ready to bring structure and discipline to Anderson Holdings. But when I returned, my father gave me tasks that felt more like busy work. Track rental reports, proofread proposals, draft memos no one read. Samantha was front and center, shaking hands, cutting ribbons, smiling for the camera. I was in the background, working quietly unseen. Then the markets turned in 2020. Office leases, stalled debt piled high, and I saw the spreadsheets bleeding red. Vendors called daily, banks threatened foreclosure. My father's health had begun to fail, and Samantha floundered under the weight of decisions she didn't understand. That was when she came to me in secret, her voice tight with fear. "Can you figure this out, Claire?" I did. I spent endless nights with numbers, building models, negotiating with lenders, balancing debt against cash flow, until a fragile path emerged. I cut costs where it hurt, refinanced loans, and consolidated assets to keep the company breathing. In 2021, when another wave threatened, I stepped in again, securing a private line of credit and convincing investors we had a plan worth saving. I held Anderson Holdings together with spreadsheets, late nights, and sheer will. But when the quarterly reports came out and the press wanted quotes, it was Samantha who stood in front of the cameras, her hand on the microphone, her name in bold. Articles praised her leadership. Partners congratulated her vision. I watched photos of her appear in business journals while my contribution remained invisible. At family dinners, my parents spoke of Samantha's resilience, of how proud they were. I swallowed it, nodding, pretending it didn't sting. But the truth always finds cracks to slip through. One evening in late 2021, as I sifted through a stack of contracts, I found something that made my stomach clench. A deal Samantha had signed with an overseas investor, terms buried in fine print that would give away controlling rights if even one payment deadline was missed. The numbers didn't add up. It was sloppy, dangerous, and reckless. I brought it to my father the next morning. Laying the papers in front of him, my voice steady though, my chest thudded with urgency. "This contract could sink us. We need to stop it." He glanced at it, adjusted his glasses, then waved a hand as if I were overreacting. "Samantha knows what she's doing. Don't worry about it, Claire." My mother, sitting nearby with her coffee, nodded along. "Let your sister handle these things. She has the experience." The dismissal burned more than the discovery itself. I had just saved the company twice in 2 years, and yet my warning was brushed aside like noise. Samantha walked into the room, then her smile bright but her eyes sharp when they met mine. She scooped up the papers, tucked them into her folder, and said lightly, "Don't stress, Claire. It's under control." I wanted to shout, to shake them, to demand they see the danger. Instead, I swallowed it the same way I had swallowed every oversight, every dismissal. But inside, something shifted. That contract wasn't just a mistake. It was a reminder that no matter how much I did, they would always see Samantha as the face and me as the shadow. That night, as I sat alone at my desk, the papers still vivid in my mind, I realized I was the only one who truly understood the stakes. And if no one else was willing to listen, I would carry the knowledge quietly until the day came when silence was no longer enough. Thomas Reynolds called me into his office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky seemed too heavy for its own weight. He had been my father's attorney for decades, a man who never wasted words, so when his assistant said he needed to see me, I went without hesitation. The office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, lined with shelves of thick binders and framed photographs of city skylines. Thomas rose from behind his desk, shook my hand firmly, and gestured for me to sit. He studied me for a moment before sliding a folder across the polished wood. "Your father wanted me to give this to you privately," he said. I opened the folder and saw the seal of the state, the careful lines of a notarized document. My father's will. I had not expected to see it so soon. My pulse quickened as I scanned the page's eyes, catching on familiar names and allocations. Then I stopped. In clean, deliberate print, it read that full control over Anderson Holdings' primary accounts, including final authority on major disbursements, rested with me. Not Samantha, not Richard, me. I looked up at Thomas, unable to hide my surprise. He nodded slowly. Robert trusted you. He wanted safeguards in place. He knew his other daughter could be impulsive. The word hung in the air, heavier than the dust motes floating in the afternoon light. For a moment I could barely breathe. My father, who so often overlooked me in life, had in death chosen me to hold the reins of the company's survival. It was a truth, carefully hidden, locked away in legal language, that only Thomas and I now shared. I ran my fingers across the ink, tracing the signature. My father's handwriting was steady even in the final months of his illness. I remembered the last conversation we had in the hospital. He had looked tired, his voice soft but clear. Take care of the company, Claire. Take care of yourself. At the time, I thought it was a vague blessing, a father's last attempt at connection. Now I realized he had meant it literally. I closed the folder gently, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile secret inside. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked. Thomas folded his hands together. He wanted you to have the freedom to choose when to use it. He believed you would know the right moment. I left his office with the folder tucked under my arm, the chill wind outside cutting against my skin. The city streets blurred as I walked, my mind racing. For years I had been the invisible one, the forgotten one, the woman pushed to the edge of every room. And yet here it was written in legal ink, undeniable. The power had been mine all along. Back at my apartment, I spread the pages across the kitchen table. The lamp overhead cast a warm glow, but my hands felt cold as I examined every line. I traced the clauses that gave me authority, the safeguards against misuse, the witnesses who had signed their names. It was airtight. And yet, a sour taste lingered. If my father had known Samantha's flaws so clearly, why had he never said anything aloud? Why had he let me sit through years of being diminished? Even in his final act of faith, he had chosen silence. A few days later, my suspicions sharpened into something more concrete. While reviewing quarterly statements, I noticed a transfer for $300,000 to a vendor I had never approved. The signature on the authorization line looked uncomfortably familiar. My own name slanted just enough to pass at first glance. I leaned closer, my chest tightening. It was not my handwriting. I pulled out an older contract, one I had signed personally, and laid them side by side. The letters were similar, but too clean, too careful. Someone had practiced. Someone had forged my name. My stomach dropped. I thought of Samantha's confident flourish when she signed her own papers, of Richard's easy arrogance, of the way they dismissed me in meetings, as if my voice were decoration. They had gone beyond disrespect. They had crossed into theft. I carried the documents to Thomas the next morning. He studied them through his glasses, jaw tightening. "This is troubling," he said, and I could see the anger beneath his calm tone. "We can pursue this legally, but it will fracture the family entirely." Fracture, I thought bitterly. The cracks had been there for years. All this time I had played the dutiful daughter, the reliable sister, while they carved pieces of the company away. My father's secret gift had not been just authority. It had been a warning. That evening I sat at my desk long after the sun had set, the documents spread before me like evidence at a trial. I remembered Samantha, laughing at a dinner party, calling me the bookkeeper in front of her friends. I remembered Richard bragging about deals he had never closed himself. And I remembered the sting of sitting at that crooked table by the kitchen, the smell of garlic and lamb in the air, the sound of her voice cutting through the room. "She doesn't run anything." Now I knew different. I did run something. I held the keys to everything they thought was theirs. I pressed my palms flat against the papers, steadying my breath. I would not act rashly. My father had trusted me with patience, with timing. But I also knew one thing for certain. The day was coming when silence would no longer protect them. I stacked the papers neatly, slid them back into the folder, and locked it away in my desk. My reflection caught in the darkened window, my face half shadow, half light. For the first time, I did not see the quiet, invisible girl they had always chosen to ignore. I saw the woman holding a truth sharp enough to cut through every lie they had ever told. The night settled heavy around me, and I sat still, listening to the hum of the city beyond the glass, knowing that sooner or later the secret I carried would demand its price. Samantha had a way of moving through the world as if every spotlight belonged to her. The local newspaper ran stories about her leadership at Anderson Holdings, complete with glossy photos of her standing in front of glass towers she had never laid the foundation for. At charity events, she posed with oversized checks and smiled as if the money had come from her personal account rather than the company I kept alive through endless late nights. People saw her as a model of success, the glamorous daughter of Robert Anderson, the confident CEO, the wife of a rising businessman. I stood at the edges of those events, holding a glass of water instead of champagne, shaking hands with vendors who remembered my emails but rarely my name. Samantha had a talent for absorbing admiration. Richard only amplified it. He was tall with a kind of easy grin that looked good in photographs, and he had mastered the art of pretending competence. I remember one evening vividly, a holiday gala at the Four Seasons in Boston. The ballroom glittered with lights and laughter. Richard took the microphone during dinner to praise Samantha's vision and her relentless drive. He went on about her role in securing new developments, about her tireless work ethic, about how the city itself owed her gratitude. I sat at table 7 between two junior associates and felt my jaw tighten. I had written every financial model that made those projects possible. I had negotiated terms with banks, juggled lines of credit, and soothed nervous investors. My name was not mentioned once. Later that night, I passed by the bar where Richard leaned against the counter with a cluster of his friends. His voice carried over the music. "Claire just balances the books," he said with a smirk. "She is like the family accountant, not really in the big picture." His friends laughed, politely raising their glasses. The words hit me like a stone to the chest. I did not confront him. I simply turned and walked away, each step echoing louder in my ears than the band playing across the room. At home that night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, mascara smudged at the corners of my eyes. I whispered the words back to myself. Just balances the books. That was how they saw me, how they wanted others to see me. A quiet figure in the background, useful but forgettable. The truth was far more complicated. By then, I had already discovered the forged signature on the transfer orders. I had already confronted the growing sense that Samantha and Richard were using the company as their personal bank. I carried that secret inside me like a loaded weapon, hidden but heavy. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by the office unexpectedly. Most of the staff had left, and the halls were dim, only a few lights buzzing overhead. I heard voices coming from the conference room and paused by the door. Samantha's laughter drifted out, followed by Richard's low tone. "We can push another $1 million through the vendor account," he said. "Claire never checks those details." My stomach dropped. I gripped the doorframe until my knuckles whitened. I walked in before either of them noticed. Richard's words froze mid-sentence. Samantha turned, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Claire, we were just discussing expansion plans." I looked at the papers spread across the table, contracts half covered by Samantha's arm. My voice was steady when I answered. "Expansion is expensive when it is not funded by actual growth." Richard gave a dismissive chuckle, but his eyes narrowed. For the rest of the weekend, their words haunted me. They were not even cautious anymore. They trusted that my silence would hold, that I would continue to play the part they had written for me. I lay awake Sunday night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, staring at the ceiling, and wondering how long they thought I would stay invisible. The public image of Samantha only grew brighter. She was invited to speak at business schools, where she talked about leadership and resilience. She was quoted in magazines about being a role model for women in business. She let interviewers write about her long nights at the office, though I knew she left by 6 while I stayed until midnight. Richard stood beside her in photographs, hand at her waist, projecting the perfect partnership. Behind closed doors, the arrogance sharpened. At one board dinner, Richard leaned across the table toward me, his voice just loud enough for the others to overhear. "You work too hard for too little recognition. Maybe you should let Samantha handle the big decisions and stick to the details." My fork paused above my plate. I looked at him, then at the faces around the table, most of them pretending not to listen. I forced a small smile and returned to my food without answering. Inside, the insult burned deep. What kept me steady was the knowledge of what Thomas had shown me. The will, the authority my father had hidden away in my name. I carried it quietly, a truth no one else at that table suspected. Richard's words were meant to diminish me, but they only reminded me of the power he did not know I held. One afternoon, while reviewing yet another set of contracts, I noticed Samantha's signature sprawled across a deal that would have put the company into $10 million of unnecessary debt. She had not consulted the finance team, had not reviewed the risk. I filed the papers into a separate drawer, one I kept locked, evidence of how reckless they had become. Each dismissal, each smirk, each stolen piece of credit added to the stack of reasons I could no longer look away. I thought of my grandmother's words from so long ago. "You are the steady one." And I realized steady did not mean passive. It meant I had been waiting, preparing, building the strength to act when the moment arrived. The moment was coming sooner than they realized. The smiles on magazine covers, the applause at charity dinners, the careless laughter in conference rooms, all of it was built on a foundation already cracking, and I was the only one who knew just how deep those cracks ran. The night I slid those papers into the locked drawer, I closed it firmly and rested my hand on the key. The office around me was silent, the city lights glowing through the window. For the first time, I let myself imagine what would happen when the truth no longer stayed hidden. It was late on a Thursday evening when I noticed the first irregular transfer. The office had emptied hours ago, but I stayed, as I often did, combing through the quarterly numbers, line by line. At first it looked like a vendor expense. Nothing unusual, just another line item among thousands. Then the amount stopped me cold. $15 million wired to a company name I had never seen before. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing. The vendor listed was Hayes Strategic Partners, a shell I quickly realized had no legitimate history. My stomach sank as I dug further. The authorization line carried Samantha's signature, neat and sweeping, and Richard's name sat proudly beside it. There was no supporting documentation, no contracts, no explanation. 15 million vanished into a void. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, the only sound in the office, besides the clicking of my keyboard. I opened the registry and traced the shell company. It linked back to an address in Providence, a law firm that specialized in limited liability setups. My heart pounded as I connected the dots. This was not an expansion strategy, it was siphoning. The next morning I confronted Samantha. She was perched at the head of the long mahogany table in the conference room, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on her coffee cup. Richard sat beside her, scrolling through his phone as if the meeting was beneath him. I slid the file across the table and held her gaze. 15 million to Hayes Strategic Partners. Care to explain? Samantha barely glanced at the papers before smiling too sweetly. It is a diversification move, Claire. You know how the market is. We are positioning for growth. Growth does not happen in a black hole, I answered sharply. There are no assets, no contracts, nothing tied to this transfer. Richard finally looked up, his grin practiced. You worry too much. It is above your pay grade. The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. My pay grade, I thought bitterly, while the accounts they abused bore my authority under our father's will. I gathered the papers calmly, sliding them back into my folder. If they noticed my trembling hands, they mistook it for weakness. That evening I sat alone in my apartment, documents spread across the kitchen table, the lamplight casting long shadows. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, anger slowly hardening into resolve. I could not pretend anymore that Samantha was simply careless. This was intentional, and Richard was her partner in every sense of the word. Over the next weeks, I dug deeper. Patterns emerged. Repeated transfers in the hundreds of thousands, all routed through different shells, all tied back to Richard. Trips labeled as business expenses were in fact vacations to the Caribbean. Company credit cards were used to cover private dinners, luxury shopping, and even down payments on properties under Richard's cousin's name. Every page I uncovered fueled the fire inside me. I was not alone in my suspicions. One late afternoon, Marcus, a senior accountant who had been with Anderson Holdings for nearly 20 years, stopped by my office. He closed the door behind him, his face pale. "Claire," he said quietly, "I do not know who else to tell. They are bleeding the company dry." He slid a stack of invoices onto my desk, duplicates and altered receipts that confirmed what I already knew. I met his eyes and saw the fear there. "Thank you, Marcus," I said softly. "You did the right thing." When he left, I pressed my palms against the cool wood of my desk and breathed deeply. It was no longer just about me. It was about every employee who trusted this company to pay their mortgages, to send their kids to college. Samantha and Richard treated it like their personal vault. I started making copies of everything: contracts, transfers, email threads that hinted at their schemes. I stored them in a locked cabinet in my apartment and another set with Thomas Reynolds. The evidence was growing undeniable, a pile of kindling waiting for the match. But each day I returned to the office, I played my role. I sat in meetings while Samantha spoke in polished phrases, while Richard made empty promises about expansion. I nodded when appropriate, asked small questions, and let them believe I was still in the shadows. Inside, I carried the knowledge that the walls were closing in. One evening as I left the building, I caught a glimpse of Samantha and Richard through the glass lobby. They were laughing, his arm around her waist, both of them radiant in their arrogance. I paused on the sidewalk, the autumn air sharp in my lungs. For a brief second I wondered how long they thought this could last. How long they thought my silence was eternal. Back home, I laid the newest set of documents across my table and sat staring at them. The numbers glowed under the lamplight, proof of betrayal, layered over years of dismissal. The memory of Richard's voice at the gala echoed in my mind. "Just balances the books." I picked up a pen and circled the transfer amounts, each stroke heavy and deliberate. The evidence was clear. Samantha and Richard were gambling with the company, with our father's legacy, with the lives of people who trusted them. And they believed I would stay quiet, just as I always had. The city outside my window pulsed with lights, horns echoing in the distance, but inside my apartment the silence was absolute. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Patience had carried me this far, but patience alone would not save what they were tearing apart. I knew then that I was not only holding proof of their greed, I was holding the choice my father had left me, the choice to act when the time was right. And with every passing day, that time was drawing closer. Thomas Reynolds asked me to meet him in his office again, and this time his voice on the phone carried a weight that made my stomach tighten. When I arrived, the blinds were half drawn against the winter light, and the air smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He slid a thick envelope across the desk and leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. Inside were copies of transfer orders, vendor receipts, and email threads. My eyes scanned the first page, and my chest constricted. My name appeared in bold print at the bottom of a wire authorization. It looked like my signature, but it was not mine. The next page was the same. And the next. Dozens of pages, each one a theft carried out with my forged approval. I lifted my gaze to Thomas, who nodded slowly. "This is systematic," he said, his voice low. "It is not just sloppiness or a one-time forgery. They have been using your authority repeatedly. If this ever came under review, the liability would fall on you unless we can prove otherwise." My hands gripped the edge of the folder until my knuckles went white. I forced myself to breathe slow and steady. Who else knows about this? I asked. He shook his head. Only me, and now you. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to your attention. For a moment the room spun as if the walls themselves leaned closer. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory, telling me to take care of the company. I swallowed hard. They think I will never fight back. Thomas studied me carefully, then leaned forward. Claire, you have a choice. You can confront them directly, or you can use the authority your father left you. But I need to know if you are prepared for what that means. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus the accountant, who had come to me weeks earlier. Can we talk? It read. Urgent. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, my pulse racing. I called him and his voice was low and shaky. Claire, they are planning to move another 10 million next week. They are using the same shell. If this keeps going, payroll will collapse. I pressed a hand against the cool wall of the corridor. Thank you for telling me, Marcus. Keep the records. Say nothing to anyone. His breath caught. Then he agreed quickly and hung up. Back in the office, I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. Thomas waited silently. I looked him in the eye. My father gave me the authority for a reason. If I do nothing, this company dies and they take me down with them. His jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. Then you understand. I nodded once. I will not act today, but I will act when the moment comes. I need them to be seen for who they are, not just by me, but by everyone who has believed their lies. He closed the folder and slid it back toward me. Then we prepare. That night, I carried the envelope home with me, the weight of it pressing against my side like a stone. I spread the pages across my dining table, each one a reminder of how far Samantha and Richard were willing to go. I thought of my co-workers, men and women, who had given decades of their lives to Anderson Holdings, unaware their futures were being gambled away. I thought of my father, who had trusted me in silence, believing I would know when to act. The anger I felt was not sharp anymore. It had cooled into something steadier, a quiet determination that pulsed with every breath. Their arrogance had grown unchecked for too long, but their time was running out. Later that week, I walked into a board meeting where Samantha was dazzling a group of directors with promises of expansion into Miami. Richard sat at her side nodding as though he had built the vision himself. I took my place at the far end of the table, my notes tucked neatly in front of me, my expression calm. Not one of them suspected that in my locked cabinet sat the documents that could unravel their empire. As the meeting dragged on, I felt the heat of Richard's gaze daring me to interrupt. I said nothing. Silence had always been my shield. But now, it was also my weapon. When the meeting adjourned, Samantha gathered her papers with a triumphant smile. "We are on the edge of something big," she said brightly. I met her eyes and gave her a small, cold smile in return. She tilted her head, puzzled, but moved on. I walked back to my office with the sound of my heels steady on the polished floor, the envelope locked in my drawer, and the knowledge that soon the mask would fall. They believed my silence meant surrender. They had no idea it was only the pause before the storm. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private dining hall in Cambridge the night before the wedding, and from the moment I walked in, I felt the air tighten around me. The walls were strung with fairy lights, the tables gleamed with polished silverware, and every laugh rang a little too loud, as if the whole room wanted to prove something. Samantha glided through the guests in a satin dress, cheeks glowing, Richard at her side with a glass of wine raised like a trophy. I chose a seat along the edge, far from the cluster of cousins and family friends who crowded around her. The chatter filled the room, clinking glasses and forced cheer. I listened quietly, stirring the ice in my water. Every detail seemed rehearsed, every compliment rehearsed too. When Samantha leaned in to thank the florist, I could hear the pride swelling in her voice, as if she were already the queen of everything she touched. Dinner was halfway through when my mother appeared at my side. She set down her napkin, leaned close, and lowered her voice. "Claire, tomorrow is about Samantha. Please do not make it harder than it needs to be." I turned my head slowly. "Harder? I repeated softly. I am not the one writing checks to shell companies. She blinked quickly, her eyes darting toward the room, then back at me. Just keep quiet. We cannot afford drama. I almost laughed at the irony. Drama was the air they breathed, yet I was the one asked to stay small. I placed my fork down carefully and met her gaze. You never asked her to stay quiet. My mother straightened, her expression unreadable, then walked away as if she had not heard me. The evening dragged toasts being made, Richard boasting about their honeymoon in Italy, Samantha smiling at each word, as if the entire world belonged to her. My father gave a short speech about family and legacy, though his voice faltered halfway through. His eyes brushed mine for a second, heavy and tired, before turning back to the crowd. When dessert was served, my phone buzzed in my purse. A message from Janet, my closest friend since college. "Are you still sure you are going tomorrow?" she wrote. I read it twice before typing back. I have to. This does not end unless I end it. Her reply came instantly. Then do not let them walk over you again. I slipped the phone away and folded my hands in my lap, watching Samantha move around the room. She was radiant, glowing under the lights, greeting every guest with practiced warmth. Richard kept his arm around her waist, his charm on full display. People adored them. And none of them saw the rot underneath. When the evening finally wound down, I walked out into the cold night air. The streets were slick from a passing drizzle, the lamps glowing halos against the damp. My heels clicked against the sidewalk, steady and sharp. Behind me, laughter spilled out of the hall, muffled by the closing doors. I pulled my coat tighter and let the chill cut through the heaviness in my chest. At home, I brewed tea. I never drank the cup cooling, untouched beside me. I sat at the table, the folder of documents locked away just a few steps from where I Saturday. I thought of my father's careful planning, of Thomas's warning, of Marcus's quiet fear. I thought of Samantha's laughter, Richard's arrogance, my mother's whispered plea for silence. It was never really about me embarrassing them. It was about the fact that if I opened my mouth, their empire would crumble. They had always known it, even if they pretended otherwise. That was why my mother wanted me to sit quietly. Not because the wedding would be ruined, but because the truth would finally rise. I pressed my palms flat against the table and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow I would step into their carefully built stage, and they would not expect what I carried with me. The tea had gone cold, the clock ticking softly in the background. I rose, placed the cup in the sink, and walked to the window. The city lay spread beneath me, lights glowing steady in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Samantha and Richard were sleeping soundly, believing the world belonged to them. I let the curtain fall back into place, turned off the light, and stood in the quiet of my apartment with my heart beating steady. The time for silence was nearly over. The wedding day began with a gray Boston sky that threatened rain but never followed through. I arrived at the hotel ballroom wearing the navy dress I had chosen weeks before. Simple and elegant, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to remind myself that I belonged there as much as anyone. Guests bustled around the lobby, cameras flashing, laughter echoing against the high ceilings. I kept my head high as I walked inside, though my chest tightened with every step. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, white roses spilling across the tables, golden accents catching the light. A band played softly near the stage, and waiters moved quickly with trays of champagne. I scanned the room, forcing myself not to rush, searching for my name on the seating chart. When I found it, my throat went dry. Table 15 tucked into the far back corner beside the swinging doors to the kitchen. I stood still, staring at the card, until a woman with a headset tapped my shoulder. "You are at 15, ma'am. Right this way." Her polite tone left no room for argument. I followed her across the room, past the elegant tables at the center where family and close friends sat, past the head table where Samantha's name gleamed in gold script beside Richard's. She led me to a small round table squeezed against the wall. The chair wobbled as I sat down, and each time the kitchen door swung open, a gust of garlic and smoke rushed out. The sound of laughter floated from the head table. Samantha raised her glass to a cluster of bridesmaids, her smile wide and polished. Richard leaned in, whispering something that made her laugh harder, her hand brushing his arm as though they were untouchable. Minutes later, Richard walked over his tuxedo jacket, unbuttoned, his grin wide. He stopped by my table, glanced at the crooked setting, and smirked. "Looks about right," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Some chuckled uncomfortably, others looked away. My chest burned, but I did not move. My mother passed by, carrying her clutch, eyes sliding quickly over me before landing elsewhere. She paused, adjusted the strap of her bag, then kept walking without a word. My father lingered a few feet away, his jaw tight, but when our eyes met, he turned his head as if he had not seen me. The message was clear. Their silence was permission. The humiliation spread like heat across my skin. I could hear the faint murmurs at the nearby tables, the subtle glances, the small smiles hidden behind glasses of wine. I knew how they would talk about it later, how the story would become another example of how little I mattered. I straightened my back, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and forced a smile. If they wanted me cornered, they would not see me break. I reached for my glass of water and lifted it slowly, letting the cold steady my hand. From the stage, the officiant called for everyone to take their seats. The ceremony would begin shortly. Guests hurried toward their tables, the noise swelling, then falling into a hush as Samantha entered. She looked radiant, her gown shimmering under the lights, her bouquet a cascade of white lilies. Gasps and sighs filled the room as she walked down the aisle, Richard beaming at the end, the picture of devotion. I watched from my corner, my view half blocked by the swinging door. Every word of the vows floated across the room, but each one rang hollow in my ears. I thought of the forged signatures, the missing millions, the arrogance that had bled the company dry. And here they were praised and adored, the golden couple at the center of it all. When the ceremony ended and the applause erupted, I remained seated, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Guests stood and crowded toward the couple, offering hugs and photographs, filling the space with congratulations. No one came toward me. The servers bustled past, plates, clattering voices shouting orders behind the doors at my side. Dinner began, courses served with precision. I picked at the food in silence, the voices around me swelling and fading. Then, as if the evening were not cruel enough, Richard approached again. He leaned down, his voice low but sharp. "You fit in well back here. Maybe you should stay out of the spotlight permanently." I met his eyes, letting the corners of my lips curl into the faintest smile. He straightened, clearly unsettled by the lack of reaction, and walked back to Samantha. She glanced at me over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, before turning back to the guests around her. I lifted my glass again, but this time I was not steadying myself. I was marking the moment, carving it into memory. The night they chose to humiliate me publicly to remind me of my place was the night I decided their place would soon collapse. The laughter resumed, the music swelled, and the room glittered on. I sat still, the smell of roasted lamb and smoke drifting from the kitchen, my phone resting like a weight in my clutch. The air around me felt heavier with each passing minute, as if the walls themselves were closing in, but I stayed calm. They thought they had reduced me to nothing. They had no idea what I was about to take from them. I slipped my hand into my clutch, the weight of the phone suddenly heavier than it had ever been. My pulse slowed, not quickened, as if my body already knew what was about to happen. I scrolled to the contact and pressed the screen. The line clicked once before a voice answered. "Freeze the accounts," I said, steady and calm. 3 words, no more. On the other end, Thomas understood immediately. "Consider it done." The call ended and I tucked the phone back without hesitation. Around me the music still played, violins carrying a tune of elegance and perfection. But beneath the surface the cracks began to show almost instantly. The catering manager approached the head table with a furrowed brow, whispering urgently to one of the wedding coordinators. A server tried to swipe a company card for the last round of payments, only for the machine to flash red. Declined. They tried again. Declined. A murmur spread among the staff, confusion simmering just out of sight of the guests. It didn't stay hidden long. The band faltered mid-song, their manager signaling nervously toward Samantha. The volume of chatter around the tables shifted, curiosity replacing laughter. Guests leaned closer to one another, voices lowered but urgent, the kind of tone that signals something has gone very wrong. I watched it unfold from my seat near the kitchen, a vantage point they thought would humiliate me, but instead gave me the perfect view. Richard pulled his phone from his pocket. I saw the color drain from his face as his screen lit up with notification after notification. His jaw clenched, his hand trembling slightly as he scrolled. Samantha reached for him, her polished smile cracking at the edges. He pulled away, staring at the numbers with disbelief. When she finally looked down at her own phone, the champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the tile. Her hand shook so badly she couldn't pick it up. Gasps rose from the nearest tables, followed by the rustle of silk dresses and polished shoes shifting uneasily. The chatter grew louder, curiosity turning to speculation, speculation turning to alarm. The string of perfect illusions they had worked so hard to maintain was unraveling in real time. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply sat straighter, my hands folded in my lap, letting the weight of silence do what it always had, only now on my terms. Then it happened. A spoon knocked from a nervous hand hit the floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the ballroom. In that instant, the entire room froze, the noise collapsing into a single piercing silence. Every pair of eyes turned toward the head table, waiting, watching, sensing that something monumental had just shifted. The day after the wedding, the headlines spread faster than wildfire. By sunrise, every business outlet carried the story of Fairchild Capital walking away from the merger. Reporters dissected every angle, anchors replayed clips of Samantha's forced smile at the altar, and Jason's name became shorthand for hubris. I sat in my office with the blinds open, the gray Boston morning pouring in, watching it all unfold in silence. My phone buzzed nonstop, but I let it ring. By mid-morning, Jason called. His voice cracked as soon as I answered. "What did you do, Caroline? You've ruined everything." He sounded less like a man and more like the boy who used to beg me to finish his homework. I let him rant, his words tumbling over each other, desperate and furious. Finally, I said, "I did exactly what you taught me." I stayed silent until it mattered. He swore, shouted something about loyalty, then hung up. An hour later, my mother showed up at my office. She looked smaller than I remembered, her pearls askew, her lipstick fading. She closed the door behind her and stood stiff near the window. "Caroline, why?" she whispered. "Why would you turn against your own family?" I took a long breath before answering. Family, I said, would never sit their daughter by the kitchen at her sister's wedding. Family would never erase years of sacrifice. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. I think she knew there was nothing left to argue. That afternoon, the board of Atlas convened an emergency meeting. I had no intention of attending, but one of the directors called me directly, voice hushed with nerves. "They are in chaos," he said. "Jason is unraveling. Investors are demanding answers. You should know they are looking to you." I thanked him but kept my tone measured. "I am not stepping in to save Jason again. Not this time." News alerts kept flashing across my screen. Atlas stock dropped another 12% by close of market. Creditors began filing motions. A supplier in Chicago leaked emails showing unpaid invoices. The fall was quick and merciless. Each report felt like the echo of laughter from that wedding table, finally turned against the people who once mocked me. Late that night, Samantha called. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. Her voice was tight, brittle. "You've humiliated us, Caroline. Do you know what you've done to me? To my reputation?" I held the phone away for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Then I said, "Samantha, you did that yourself when you tried to bury me," with a smirk. She gasped and hung up. The following morning, the Fairchilds issued a statement. They expressed disappointment, blamed Atlas leadership for misrepresentation, and publicly praised me as the only person they had found trustworthy during negotiations. My name, once buried, was printed in bold across every major paper. Jason must have choked when he read it. That evening, I walked past the hotel where the wedding had taken place. The same chandeliers glowed in the lobby, but the celebration was gone. A lone worker dismantled the floral arches, petals scattered across the sidewalk like confetti left to rot. I paused the cool night air brushing my face and thought about how quickly illusions collapse. Inside, a group of guests from another event laughed over cocktails, oblivious to the ruin that had taken place only days before. I kept walking, my heels striking steady against the pavement, each step carrying me further from the girl who once sat silent in the corner. Back in my office, files spread across the desk, I poured myself a glass of water and sat down. The city lights blinked through the window, steady and bright. My assistant knocked softly and stepped in. "Caroline, people are asking what comes next. Do you want to make a statement?" I shook my head. Not yet. Silence had carried me this far, and I knew the value of timing. The phone rang again, Jason's number flashing. I let it ring until it stopped. Minutes later, a text appeared. "Please, we need you." I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked, every cold silence at family dinners. Then I deleted the message without replying. The night stretched on quiet, except for the hum of the city outside. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt no urgency to prove myself, no desperate need to be seen. They had already seen me, and it had undone them. The next morning brought more headlines. Analysts predicted Atlas would declare bankruptcy within weeks. Lawsuits mounted. Shareholders clamored for leadership change, but it was already too late. Jason and Samantha had become symbols of arrogance and failure, and me, the sister they had dismissed, had become the shadow they could not escape. As I watched the sun rise over Boston Harbor, I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. The story was no longer about what they had taken from me. It was about what I had chosen to take back. I set my glass down, opened a fresh folder, and began to plan. This time not in the shadows, not in silence, but in full control of what came next. The weeks that followed felt like watching a storm strip a house down to its frame. Atlas crumbled piece by piece. Vendors pulled contracts, banks froze credit lines, and employees walked out with cardboard boxes under their arms. Jason tried to salvage something with late-night statements and rushed meetings, but each appearance only made the cracks more visible. Samantha vanished from the spotlight, her glamorous friends turning quiet once the money dried up. What had once been their empire now looked like a hollow shell. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Every headline that once carried Jason's smiling face now spelled his downfall. The world finally saw what I had lived for years, that his charm was shallow, and borrowed, that his victories were never truly his own. My silence had spoken louder than his speeches. One morning I received a call from the board. They wanted me to return to steady the ship, to salvage what little remained. I listened carefully, then told them no. I had built something else, something stronger, away from their blindness. They had looked past me for too long, and I had no reason to step back into the shadows of a broken empire. Instead, I poured my time into Harbor 12, the holding company I had created quietly years before. The founders I had backed during their hardest days now stood stronger than ever, and they welcomed me not as a silent helper, but as a partner. Each meeting carried a different energy than anything I had known at Atlas. It was honest, collaborative, built on respect rather than image. I felt a kind of pride that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with building something right. My mother tried again, showing up at my apartment one Sunday. She looked tired, her voice softer than I had ever heard. "Caroline," she said, "families make mistakes, but we can start again." I stood in the doorway, torn between the child who had once longed for her approval and the woman who had finally stopped needing it. I told her I hoped she found peace, but I would not carry the weight of their choices anymore. For the first time, I closed the door without guilt. Jason never came himself. He sent letters, frantic emails, even left a voicemail once, his voice hoarse from defeat. Please, Caroline, help me fix this. I deleted each one. My silence was the only answer he would ever get from me again. Months passed and the city moved on. New scandals filled the papers, new deals dominated the news. Atlas became a cautionary tale in business schools, a case study of arrogance and neglect. And me, I became a quiet success story. The woman who built a lattice of companies that thrived while her family burned their legacy to the ground. One evening, I stood at the window of my office, the skyline glittering beyond the glass. A wedding reception was underway in the courtyard, below strings of lights swaying in the breeze, music spilling into the night. I watched the laughter, the clinking glasses, the photographs being taken under arches of flowers. For a moment, it stung, the memory of the kitchen table at my sister's wedding rising like smoke. But then it passed. That humiliation had been their final gift, the spark that freed me from their cage. I turned back to my desk, where contracts lay waiting, not for Jason, not for Samantha, not for my parents, but for me. Every signature was mine. Every decision bore my name. No one could erase it now. I lifted a glass of water, clear and cold, and raised it slightly toward the window. Not in a toast to them, but to myself, to the woman they underestimated until it was too late. If you've ever been overlooked, pushed aside, or told you don't matter, I hope my story reminds you that silence is not weakness. It can be power waiting for the right moment. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been dismissed by people who should have stood by you? Have you ever dreamed of turning that pain into strength? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what resonated with you. And if you want to hear more stories where justice finds its way back, make sure you stay with this channel. There are more stories coming, each one carrying a lesson, a reckoning, and a reminder that sometimes karma does not whisper, it roars.